When Howard Carter peered into Tutankhamun's tomb, the world expected stories of gold, power, and a serene king at rest. But the reality was far more complex, whispered through the artifacts left behind. The tomb wasn't just a treasure chest. It was a crime scene, a medical chart, and a confession all rolled into one. As torchlight danced across walls unseen for 3 millennia, it illuminated a story not of a mighty pharaoh, but of a frail boy king, plagued by illness and trapped by his royal duties. The hurried burial, the strange placement of objects, the hidden injuries on his mummy, all pointed to a rushed, mysterious end. This wasn't the glorious afterlife of a god king. This was the final, quiet record of a boy's struggle, a secret sealed in gold, begging to be understood. What really happened to King Tut? The whispers from his tomb are just the beginning of the story. They say some doors should never be opened, not because something will leap out, not because of curses carved into stone, but because once a sealed place is disturbed, the past begins to breathe again. And when history breathes, it doesn't shout, it whispers, slowly, patiently, waiting to be heard. On a quiet morning in November 1922, in a forgotten corner of Egypt's Valley of the Kings, the ground gave up a secret it had been holding for more than 3,000 years. There was no grand ceremony, no trumpet fanfare, just dust, sweat, and the sound of a chisel tapping stone that had yet felt a human touch since the Bronze Age was still young. Howard Carter, the man leading the dig, knew before he ever looked inside that this was not an ordinary discovery. He had spent years chasing ghosts through the desert, following rumors that other, more respected archaeologists had long abandoned. Most believed the Valley of the Kings was finished, emptied, stripped clean by thieves ages ago. But Carter believed in leftovers, in mistakes, in things forgotten because they were considered unimportant. And he was right. The first clue that something was different was the size of the tomb. It was small, too small. That was the first wrong thing. Pharaohs were supposed to rest in vast, sprawling underground palaces, their walls carved with prayers, spells, and warnings meant to last for eternity. This place felt rushed, cramped, almost unfinished, as if someone had not planned to die. When Carter made a small opening in the door and pushed a candle inside, the flame flickered strangely. The air that escaped was ancient, heavy, sealed for millennia. 3,000 years of breath, exhaled all at once. From behind him, someone asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter paused for a moment longer than necessary. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet. "Wonderful things." Gold reflected the candlelight like frozen sunlight. Statues stared back with eyes of obsidian, their expressions filled with judgment. Thrones, chariots, jewelry, and ritual objects were piled tightly together, almost chaotically. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty. Yes, but it was an anxious beauty, a defensive beauty, as if the dead were afraid of being disturbed. And at the center of it all lay Tutankhamun, a boy king, a historical footnote, a ruler so insignificant that his name had been systematically erased from history by those who followed him. His monuments were defaced, his cartouches smashed, his memory was deliberately destroyed. In ancient Egypt, this was a fate worse than death. It was and yet, here he was, perfectly preserved by neglect. Greater, more powerful kings had been looted, their bodies burned, their treasures scattered to the winds. But Tutankhamun survived because no one had cared enough to rob him. His obscurity was his salvation, but obscurity also hides things. As the team began to catalogue the artifacts and examine the body, a feeling grew that something was wrong, not cursed, not supernatural, just wrong. Egyptologists are trained to see patterns, and Tutankhamun's burial simply didn't follow them. The objects were magnificent, but their placement suggested extreme haste. Certain rituals were incomplete. Some protective spells were missing or misapplied. An excessive amount of resin had been poured over the coffin, fusing it shut and, as they would later discover, literally burning the skin of the mummy beneath. When they tried to remove the king from his coffin, the body broke. It simply cracked apart under the gentlest pressure. The limbs separated. The skin, blackened and brittle, was fused to the golden mask. This was not how royal mummification was supposed to work. Ancient Egyptian embalmers were meticulous, almost obsessive craftsmen. They had perfected the art of preserving bodies for eternity with astonishing precision. So why did they fail so spectacularly here? Tutankhamun's bones told a story that no inscription ever would. His skull was unusually fragile. His chest showed signs of severe trauma, and his leg had been shattered just before death. a compound fracture so severe it showed no signs of healing. A broken leg alone could easily be a death sentence in the ancient world. Infection, blood poisoning, or simple immobility could prove fatal. But kings didn't just break their legs. Kings were protected, guarded, watched. Unless, of course, the danger came from inside the palace. To understand this, we have to look at the world Tutankhamun was born into. His father, Akhenaten, was a heretic who had tried to rewrite reality itself. He abandoned Egypt's ancient pantheon of gods and replaced them with a single deity, the sun disk, Aten. He closed the old temples, stripped the priests of their power, and threw the entire religious order into chaos. The empire did not forgive this. When Akhenaten died, Egypt was fragile, confused, and deeply resentful. Tutankhamun was just a child when he took the throne, a puppet controlled by powerful advisors, priests, and generals who were desperate to restore the old world. His very name was changed to reflect this reversal from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amen. Even his identity was rewritten for him. But his body paid the price of generations of royal inbreeding. He suffered from deformed bones, a club foot, and chronic illness. More than 100 walking canes were placed in his tomb. These were not symbols of power, they were tools for survival. A weak king is a problem. A weak king in a recovering empire is a liability. And in the high-stakes world of royal courts, liabilities rarely live long. The official story might suggest illness or an accident. But history rarely kills inconvenient young kings so quietly. Then came the deaths that followed the opening of the tomb. Not instantly, not dramatically, but one by one. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's wealthy financial backer, died from an infected mosquito bite that turned septic. He suffered from fever, delirium, and then silence. Newspapers devoured the story. The curse of the pharaoh was born. But curses are a distraction from responsibility. The truth is often less mystical and far more uncomfortable. Ancient tombs are sealed environments. Mold spores, bacteria, and toxic compounds can remain trapped for millennia. When disturbed, they become invisible weapons. The tomb didn't curse anyone. It simply defended itself with microbiology. Still, that wasn't the real secret history whispered by the dust. The real secret was that ancient Egyptians already knew that disturbing graves was dangerous, not because of magic, but because tombs contained truth, political truth, religious truth, evidence of fear and conspiracy. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't built to honor him. It was built to contain him, to seal away the uncomfortable questions surrounding his life and sudden death. It was designed to distract eternity with gold, so that no one would ask why a young king died so suddenly, why his burial was so rushed, why his successors erased him from memory, and why they rebuilt Egypt as if he had never existed at all. The tomb was a cover-up, and when Howard Carter opened it, history inhaled, and reluctantly, began to whisper its secrets once more. We all know the image, the stunning golden mask of Tutankhamun, a symbol of ancient Egypt's incredible wealth and power. But what if I told you that mask, that glittering gold, was hiding a terrible secret? A story not of a god-king, but of a boy in constant pain, a ruler who never truly ruled, and a death so mysterious it was covered up in a panic. When Howard Carter opened that long-lost tomb in 1922, the world was blinded by gold, thrones, chariots, priceless jewels. It was the greatest archaeological find in history. But as the candlelight flickered across the treasures, it also revealed something else, something much darker. Beneath the golden mask, Tutankhamun's body told a story of suffering. His bones were fragile, whispering of generations of inbreeding meant to keep the royal bloodline pure. His spine was twisted, his chest was caved in, and his leg was shattered. This wasn't just a simple break from a fall. The damage was violent, the kind of injury that speaks of a catastrophic event. Yet, there are no records, no hieroglyphs that explain what happened. The only testimony lies in the boy king's remains, and the tomb itself holds clues. For all its splendor, it was prepared in a hurry. The burial chamber is small, almost cramped for a pharaoh. Artifacts were packed in, stacked without the usual reverence and care. Look closely, and you'll see tiny scratches on the inner coffin, maybe from frantic movements during the burial. Resin, used in the mummification process, was applied unevenly, almost carelessly, staining the flesh beneath the gold. This wasn't the meticulous, sacred ritual you'd expect for a king. This was panic. The priests and embalmers knew something that needed to be hidden, even from the gods. So what happened to Tutankhamun? He was only around 19 when he died. His family's genetics were a ticking time bomb, yes, but the trauma his body shows goes beyond inherited weakness. Some scholars believe he suffered from repeated bouts of severe malaria. Others point to that devastating leg fracture. The wound was infected, and it never healed. We can see evidence of desperate medical treatment, but it wasn't enough. Was it an accident, a fall from a chariot, or was it something more sinister? The sheer number of canes found in his tomb, over 130 of them, tells us a story in itself. These weren't just ceremonial objects, they were well used. This was a king who couldn't walk without help. Imagine that, the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, hobbling on a stick, his body racked with pain. The treasures, in a way, were a brilliant misdirection. They scream, look at our wealth, our power, our glory, to draw your eyes away from the frail, broken body at the center of it all, away from the failures and fears that haunted Tutankhamun's short life. He was a boy thrust onto the throne during a time of immense political and religious chaos. His father, Akhenaten, had turned Egypt on its head, abandoning the old gods. Tutankhamun was the puppet king, a child manipulated by powerful priests and generals who wanted to restore the old order and secure their own positions. His very survival for 10 years on the throne was a minor miracle, but he was never truly in control. His illnesses, his deformities, his sudden death, these were political liabilities as much as biological tragedies. And there's a chilling postscript to this story. When Carter's team entered the tomb, they didn't just find gold. They unleashed something else. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of ancient oils and decay. Soon, people associated with the discovery started falling ill. Newspapers screamed about the curse of the pharaoh, but the truth was probably more rational and more unsettling. The tomb was a perfectly sealed container for millennial pathogens, fungi, and dust. Opening it stirred them back to life. In a way, the tomb continued to protect its secrets, even after it was opened. The psychological weight of the place was undeniable. Visitors felt it. The immense layering of gold wasn't just for show. It was a barrier, a shield to hide an uncomfortable reality, that even kings can be powerless, that history often forgets the weak, and that entire civilizations will go to extraordinary lengths to hide their failures. The tomb of Tutankhamun is a warning. It says, look, but don't see too closely. Admire the gold, but don't ask what it's hiding. The world marveled at the treasures, while the real story of fragility, panic, and desperation remained buried. Over the years, theories have swirled. A fractured skull seen in early X-rays led to murder conspiracies. Later, advanced CT scans pointed to the infected leg fracture as the likely cause of death, possibly complicated by malaria. Each new technology gives us another piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remains elusive. The boy king, forgotten for 3,000 years and then rediscovered, continues to speak to us, not through grand inscriptions, but through the silent evidence of his own body and the hasty, panicked preparations for his journey into the afterlife. His story is a powerful reflection of our own world, of our tendency to hide sickness behind a veneer of beauty, to protect reputations at the cost of truth. The golden mask smiles its serene, eternal smile. The chariots wait for a race that will never happen, and the boy king sleeps on, surrounded by a splendor that both honors and conceals him. He remains fragile, misunderstood, and forever whispering the darkest secrets of an empire that enshrined him in gold but could not save him in life. Why do we remember King Tut? Is it for the dazzling gold, the mountain of treasure, the iconic mask? For a century, that's been the story. But what if all that glitter was just a distraction, a brilliant, golden lie designed to hide a much darker truth? Today, we're going to look past the shine and listen to the whispers coming from the tomb itself. Whispers written not in hieroglyphs, but in bone. When Howard Carter first peered into Tutankhamun's tomb, he saw wonderful things, but the most wonderful, and perhaps most tragic, thing of all was the boy king himself. The fractures in Tutankhamun's body tell a story the inscriptions never dared to. His skull shows faint cracks, so subtle they're almost invisible. His leg was shattered in a way that's hard to explain with a simple fall. It suggests immense force, maybe a hunting accident, or maybe something more deliberate. His spine was twisted, a sign of chronic illness, but it also held traces of old, poorly healed injuries. To us, these are clues in a cold case over 3,000 years old, but to the priests who buried him, they were a problem, a huge problem. The burial was rushed, not out of disrespect, but out of fear. A sudden death in the royal family was a sign of instability, and ancient Egypt feared weak kings above all else. A weak king invited chaos, conspiracy, and even murder. Tutankhamun, just a teenager, had been a symbol of a return to tradition after his father's radical religious reforms. His sudden death threw the entire court into a panic. The famous golden mask, with its serene, perfect features, is almost a cruel joke. It hides a truth that was anything but peaceful. The boy inside had suffered chronic illnesses, likely made every single step an ordeal. Malaria may have ravaged his body, yet the priests needed him to appear godlike, untouchable. His fragile bones, the evidence of inbreeding, the fractious, these were inconvenient truths. And in a culture obsessed with perfection, such truths had to be buried. So they poured gold, tons of it, over the tomb and the body, as if the sheer brilliance of the metal could blind eternity to the king's weakness. And then there are the canes. Over 130 of them were found in the tomb. These weren't just for show. Some are clearly worn down from use. They were tools for survival. Each cane represents a moment Tutankhamun had to rely on human invention to overcome the frailty he inherited. Imagine a king, surrounded by treasures fit for a god, yet so human, so weak, so mortal, that he couldn't walk without help. The tomb is a paradox, a monument to godly power filled with proof of human weakness. This is where the story gets even darker. We can't ignore the political danger that surrounded Tutankhamun's death. His sudden demise conveniently restored power to the old priesthood and removed a fragile child from the throne. Was it just a tragic accident, or was it political necessity? Some historians are convinced he was murdered. A blow to the head, that fractured leg inflicted on purpose. The evidence is circumstantial, but it's there. The cracks in the skull, the strange angle of the broken leg, the hasty embalming, the rushed sealing of the tomb. The tomb itself becomes a witness, its treasures an elaborate distraction. The glittering gold, a cover-up for what the living wanted to forget. And of course, this led to the whispers of a curse. When the tomb's financier, Lord Carnarvon, died from an infected mosquito bite shortly after the opening, newspapers went wild. The legend of Tutankhamun's curse was born. Even Howard Carter, a man of science, couldn't he ignore the strange illnesses and fevers that seemed to follow those who spent time in the tomb. Modern science points to ancient molds, bacteria, and toxic spores released from the sealed chamber. But back then, it felt like divine retribution, as if the tomb itself was alive, warning people away. Every artifact seemed to carry a piece of the secret. The chariots, beautifully carved and inlaid with gold, weren't just for ceremony. They were symbols of power, meant to project an image of a strong, active king. The statues of gods weren't just there to honor him. They were guards, facing outwards, as if to keep watch on the living, to keep the secrets in. A series of shrines, one nested inside the other, were designed to confuse and divert attention from the real story at the center of it all. The entire tomb was a masterclass in propaganda, engineered to shout strength, permanence, and godhood, a stunning lie told in gold. But if you listen to the silences, the truth starts to emerge. The cracks in the walls, the hastily applied resin, the artifacts piled up in a hurry, it all speaks of urgency and fear. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the illusion of stability. And yet, the truth seeped through. It's there in the brittle bones, the broken leg, and the rushed burial. The whisper is clear. Even kings, anointed by gods, are subject to weakness, to politics, and to mortality. For decades, the world marveled at the gold. The museum exhibitions, the photographs, the documentaries, everyone focused on the splendor and the treasure. We failed to notice the body. We failed to see the cracks. The real story, the boy king's suffering, became background noise to a spectacle of wealth. But quietly, scholars began to acknowledge the anomalies. They debated whether it was murder, disease, or an accident. But few looked at the bigger picture. A civilization so obsessed with divine perfection that when faced with human frailty, it scrambled to hide it with gold, ritual, and secrecy. Tutankhamun's death wasn't just a death. It was a revelation of fear. It shows us humanity's timeless attempt to mask its own imperfections. And the tomb remains silent in its brilliance, as if daring us to look closer, to see what we've been ignoring. The boy king's body, fragile and broken, lies in gilded splendor, a monument to mortality, a whisper of panic, and a cautionary tale written not in hieroglyphs, but in bone. The gold could hide the decay, the mask could hide the fear, but nothing could erase the story embedded in the remains themselves. a story that was waiting for us to finally listen. When Howard Carter first breached the sealed doorway in 1922, the world saw only gold, an avalanche of glittering treasures that seemed to prove the eternal glory of the pharaohs. But once the initial excitement faded, a darker story began to emerge. The tomb continued to speak, quietly but insistently, to those who stayed behind. Beneath the shimmering gold, behind the perfectly carved masks and ornamental chariots, the body of Tutankhamun himself revealed secrets that no textbook could ever fully capture. Every broken bone, every trace of infection, every unnatural fracture told a story not of a god, but of a fragile human being. Modern forensic analysis has tried to piece it all together: malaria, brittle bones from inbreeding, a severe clubfoot, and a badly broken leg. Each theory offers a piece of the puzzle, but none truly captures the essence of his life. That a boy barely 18 carried the crushing weight of a collapsing dynasty and paid for it with a life that was both painfully controlled and profoundly vulnerable. The burial itself whispers of panic, the rushed embalming, the uneven layers of resin. These aren't signs of reverence, but of haste. The priests who prepared the tomb knew the danger of exposing royal mortality. They understood that a weak king could destabilize an entire society, that questions about a fragile ruler could challenge centuries of divine authority. They knew that even death itself had to be managed with absolute precision. So, they moved quickly. They layered on the gold, piled up the treasures, and sealed the chambers. But in their rush, they left behind traces, cracks in the coffin, discolored resins, imperfect seals, tiny whispers that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. These were the fingerprints of desperate human hands, trying to preserve not just the king, but the illusion of his godhood. Among the most disturbing revelations was the leg. The fracture was so severe, it likely led to his death, possibly through a raging infection. The bone shows no signs of proper healing, suggesting the injury happened shortly before he died. This, combined with the fragile condition of his skeleton, paints a picture of a boy who lived with chronic pain and dependency. His body was a map of suffering, each contour and crack a testament to the immense pressures placed upon him from birth. Even the treasures surrounding him tell a darker story. The sheer number of walking canes found in the tomb, over 130 of them, some delicate, some strong, suggests that simply moving was a daily challenge. The magnificent thrones and chariots, often seen as symbols of power, might have been compensatory. There were tools to project strength from a body that was too weak to assert it naturally. Tutankhamun's reign, so brief and constrained, was immortalized not by great deeds, but by an illusion of stability, created by artifacts carefully chosen to mislead both the living and eternity itself. The gold was a mask, and the masks themselves were a mask. Everything in the tomb performed a function beyond mere decoration. And then, of course, there was the legend of the curse. Lord Carnarvon's sudden death from an infected mosquito bite, the minor illnesses that plagued Carter's team. The media frenzy had all fed a myth that conveniently distracted from the grim reality. The truth, as historians understand it, is less cinematic but far more unsettling. The tomb's sealed environment contained centuries of dormant biological matter, fungi, bacteria, and mold spores that could easily sicken those who disturbed them. The death toll, though small, was more a consequence of exposure than of ancient magic. But for those present in 1922, it all felt like vengeance, the past pushing back against their intrusion. Politics played just as big a role as biology. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, had turned Egypt on its head, throwing out the old gods for a single sun deity. Tutankhamun's sudden death allowed the old religious order to be restored. The priests who had been stripped of their power regained control. Officials who had carefully maneuvered around a child king now operated without restraint. His tomb wasn't just a resting place. It was a carefully designed instrument of concealment. Its dazzling treasures were deliberate distractions. They kept the world focused on gold, on beauty, on spectacle, while the real story, the story of illness, fragility, political necessity, and possibly even foul play, remained buried. Even our most advanced analyses can't fully penetrate the tomb's secrets. X-rays, CT scans, and DNA studies give us glimpses. They hint at malaria, bone fragility, and genetic deformities. They suggest accidents or even deliberate injury. But what they can't capture is the human dimension. The boy who walked with canes, who endured constant scrutiny, whose life ended abruptly before he ever had a chance to be his own person. The tomb's gold can't conceal the terror of existing in such a role, nor can it hide the whispers of those who orchestrated his burial, anxious to preserve, not the boy but the stability of the world he left behind. The gold, the chariots, the ornate beds, they were all part of a silent narrative, one that hid as much as it revealed. We are naturally drawn to the shine, to the craftsmanship, to the aesthetic perfection, but it's the imperfections that tell the more compelling story. The tomb's cramped layout, the hurried stacking of ritual items, the rough placement of objects within shrines, these are all fingerprints of urgency, of panic, of human error. Each misalignment is a clue, a whisper of the anxiety surrounding this king's death and legacy. It's the fear that human frailty might shatter the perception of divine perfection. And so, Tutankhamun's tomb became both a treasure trove and a confession of human weakness, of political expediency, of a panic buried under layers of gold. Every artifact, every mask, every one of those walking sticks whispers the same thing. Even kings, even those touched by divinity, are mortal. They suffer, they falter, and sometimes they die far too soon. The grandeur of the tomb is both a tribute and a veil, a duality that has fascinated us for a century. Ultimately, the tomb's darkest secret is not a curse. It is a mirror held up to history itself. It shows us that power cannot shield fragility, that wealth cannot protect the body from disease or accident, and that human hands, no matter how skilled, cannot fully control mortality. Tutankhamun lies beneath all that gold and glitter, but he is not immortal. His story, whispered through cracks in bone and imperfections in his burial, reminds us that history is never as clean, as perfect, or as eternal as it seems. The boy king, forgotten once and rediscovered, continues to whisper, reminding us that sometimes the most dazzling treasures conceal the most uncomfortable truths. For over a century, the tomb of Tutankhamun has dazzled the world. We see the gold, the splendor, the vision of a divine king. But what if all that glitter isn't the real story? What if it's a magnificent distraction, a golden curtain hiding a much darker, more fragile truth? Today, we're pulling back that curtain to reveal the boy king not as a god, but as a prisoner of his own fragile body and a court terrified of the truth. Decades after Howard Carter first peered into that darkness, the body of Tutankhamun refuses to rest quietly. Every new scientific analysis, every CT scan, DNA test, and X-ray pulls back a layer of the myth, only to reveal more questions. Was it malaria that slowly crippled him? Was it a brittle bone disease that made every step in agony? Or was it something far more sinister? The boy king's death is a cold case for the ages, a silent interrogation of human frailty, politics, and fear, all encoded in his very bones. One of the most profound clues lies in his foot. Tutankhamun had a club foot, a severe deformity, likely a tragic consequence of generations of royal inbreeding. This wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It was a visible crack in the divine facade, a god-king who couldn't walk properly. It was a symbol of vulnerability that had to be managed. Archaeologists found over 130 walking canes in his tomb. For years, we saw them as ceremonial objects, symbols of authority. But the truth is much more personal and poignant. These weren't for show, they were necessities. Each cane tells a story of a daily struggle, of a boy leaning on a stick just to bear the weight of his own crown. And then there are the injuries that just don't add up. A fracture in his skull, subtle but telling. A severely broken leg, snapped just above the knee. The official story might suggest a hunting accident, a fall from a chariot. But some experts look at the evidence, the angle of the breaks, the signs of a severe open wound, and the sheer haste of his mummification, and they see something else. A history this complex is never straightforward. Could it be that Tutankhamun's natural fragility collided with the brutal politics of the Egyptian court, leading to a death that was both tragic and politically convenient? The tomb itself screams urgency. Forget the neat ceremonial arrangements you see in museums. When Carter entered, he found chaos. Objects were piled up, almost thrown in. Precious resin, meant to anoint the body, was poured so heavily that it fused the king to his solid gold coffin, a black, sticky mass that both preserved and obscured him. It's tempting to call this incompetence, a rushed and sloppy job. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was fear. The priests and officials knew that a weak king, even a dead one, was a threat. The political fallout from a vulnerable ruler could destabilize the entire empire. So they buried him, not just in a tomb, but under layers of gold and treasure, a brilliant strategy of concealment. designed to distract anyone who dared to look too closely at the boy behind the mask. In this chaotic, hurried burial, they were trying to silence a story. But the whispers have a way of getting out. He was a child, thrust onto the most powerful throne on earth during a time of immense political and religious turmoil. He was sickly, deformed, and constantly watched. Every decision, every public appearance, was carefully managed by the powerful figures in his court, like his advisor Ai and General Horemheb. These men guided his reign, and it seems increasingly likely they dictated the terms of his death and burial. His tomb, then, is not just a shrine. It's a documented record of human panic and a desperate attempt to impose an image of perfection on a life that was anything but. Think about that famous golden mask. It is the pinnacle of Egyptian artistry, a face of serene, symmetrical perfection. We admire its beauty, its flawless expression, but it's also a lie. It's a psychological shield designed to impose divine order over the chaos and mortality of the body hidden beneath. A body broken by disease, genetic fragility, and traumatic injury. Every gleaming line, every inlaid jewel, is both beauty and deception, hiding the vulnerabilities that the powerful men of his court dared not let the world see. For years, the sensational stories of the pharaoh's curse grabbed all the headlines. The strange illnesses and deaths that befell some who entered the tomb were perfect for myth. Science now tells us these were likely caused by ancient mold and bacteria, released after millennia. But the real curse, the real horror, is much quieter and far more human. It's the story of a fragile boy, a hurried burial, and the cold political calculus that may have sealed his fate. It's a story that no headline can ever truly capture. Modern historians can be misled, just like the tomb raiders of old. We see the thrones, chariots, and ceremonial beds, and we think of strength, authority, and power. We see the canes and assume they represent stability, but in reality, they speak of weakness, illness, and a desperate struggle to maintain an illusion. They are props in a carefully choreographed performance, a grand play designed to mask human frailty and construct a narrative of power where there was very little. Tutankhamun's death changed everything. The men who had maneuvered around him, who had controlled him, finally took control for themselves. His tomb, with all its splendor, became the final instrument in their careful management of history. Even now, a century later, the case is not closed. Scholars continue to debate. Was it malaria, bone disease, an accident, or was it murder? Every new discovery brings new clues but never a final answer. The boy king remains an enigma, preserved in gold, yet painfully human, fragile, vulnerable, and a victim of forces far beyond his control. His story is a profound cautionary tale. It reminds us that history often chooses spectacle over truth. It shows us how icily gold can be used to hide fragility, and how even those raised to the status of gods are subject to the same pain and vulnerability as the rest of us. And so, the tomb continues to speak. It speaks quietly, not in curses, but in the cracks in a bone, in the chaos of a burial chamber, and in the sheer overwhelming weight of its treasures. It whispers of panic, of desperation, and of the brutal realities of power. It reminds us that even kings are mortal, that perfection is an illusion, and that the past, no matter how deeply it's buried, always finds a way to whisper its truths to those who are patient enough to listen. Tutankhamun's life was brief, but its echoes resonate still not in myth, but in the quiet, heartbreaking story of the fragile boy hidden beneath eternity's golden mask. The closer we look at Tutankhamun, the more we realize his story isn't just about gold and curses. It's a tangled web of politics, power, and profound human weakness. The boy king's death was sudden, inconvenient, and for some, incredibly useful. At just 18 years old, he held very little real power. His main purpose was to be a symbol, a centerpiece for Egypt's fragile return to its old gods after his father's chaotic religious revolution. From the moment he took the throne, Tutankhamun was never truly in control. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by priests, generals, and ambitious nobles. They all knew that a weak king, if not carefully managed, could become a serious liability. So they guided him, they controlled him, and they watched his every move. This is why the clues found on his body are so chilling. A broken leg, a fractured skull, a twisted spine. Any one of these could be an accident or a birth defect, but all of them together, combined with the suspicious timing of his death and the incredible rush to bury him, that points to a story someone desperately wanted to hide. Was he murdered? Was he just unlucky? Or was his death a perfect storm of chronic illness, genetic weakness, and a fatal misstep. The tomb doesn't give us a straight answer, it just whispers. Every artifact placed in a hurry, every uneven seal on the doors, every smear of resin feels like a clue pointing towards panic and a cover-up. We can't ignore the political drama. The court of Egypt at that time was a snake pit of intrigue. The powerful figures surrounding Tutankhamun had all survived his father Akhenaten's religious purges, and they were constantly jostling for power. A weak ruler like Tutankhamun was a pawn in their game. The moment he became a problem, the moment he fell ill, the court would have moved with lightning speed to protect itself, to reorganize the power structure, and to make sure the official story of his death was the only one ever told. The frantic embalming and the sheer volume of treasure piled into his tomb were all part of this strategy. They were trying to shield the boy king's weaknesses from history. The gold was a brilliant distraction, its beauty masking the boy's vulnerability, its craftsmanship hiding his fragile humanity. Even the layout of the tomb tells this story. Statues of God's face outward, as if they're not just being honored, but are standing guard, watching the living to enforce the illusion that everything was fine. Thrones and beds, while stunning, are sometimes placed slightly off-kilter, suggesting they were put there in a rush, not with the slow care of a royal ceremony. And the canes, so many canes. They were presented as symbols of power, but they were there because he desperately needed them to walk. Every object sends a double message. Look at this power, this divinity, but please, ignore the frail human boy beneath it all. If you look closely at the imperfections, you can almost hear the whispers. Tutankhamun was human. He was vulnerable. He was broken. Modern analysis of his body confirms this. His bones and teeth tell a story of chronic health problems, made worse by generations of inbreeding in the royal family. He had a clubfoot, a deformed pelvis, and weak bones that made walking a painful struggle. He likely suffered from repeated bouts of malaria, which would have left his immune system shattered. For a body this fragile, even a small injury could have been a death sentence. And yet, this was the boy expected to be a god on earth, the symbol of stability for an entire empire. He carried the weight of a nation on his broken shoulders. And then there's the timing. That broken leg, which likely happened in the last days of his life, was it an accident, or was it something more? The combination of a severe injury, his underlying illnesses, and the suspiciously hurried burial all point to a court in crisis mode, desperate to control the narrative. The embalming itself, while it preserved the body, was sloppy. Resins were poured on so thick they fused with his flesh. His organs were mishandled. The process was a rush job. What we see today is a boy king trapped in a horrifying limbo, preserved, yet mangled, magnificent, yet fragile. The tomb itself was a tool of perception management. It was a statement of divine authority, designed to hide human weakness and distract from the ugly reality of political maneuvering. The famous curse of the pharaohs, sensationalized by newspapers, was another brilliant distraction. It gave the world a supernatural story to focus on, because the real story was far more disturbing. Lord Carnarvon's sudden death, the minor illnesses that plagued Howard Carter's team, these weren't the work of an ancient curse. It was a predictable cocktail of mold, bacteria, and sealed-up pathogens released into the air for the first time in 3,000 years. The world preferred the myth because the truth was too uncomfortable to face. A fragile, manipulated boy king died in a way that exposed the terrible human cost of being treated like a god. Every single treasure pulled from that tomb reinforces this sad reality. The chariots and thrones project an image of power, but hint at the real-world necessity behind them. The ceremonial canes scream of his mobility problems. The golden statues and that iconic mask offer an image of divine perfection, but they conceal a body ravaged by trauma, infection, and genetic frailty. The tomb is a story with hidden layers, intentionally designed to mislead, but accidentally revealing the truth in its flaws. Each crack, each smear, each misaligned object is a whisper of the truth the court tried so hard to bury. They tried to shout to the heavens that their king was perfect, but they couldn't hide the fact that he was human. Modern science can't solve every mystery, but it can reveal the patterns. The combination of malaria, genetic disorders, and severe injuries paints a clear picture of a life lived under unbearable pressure. Tutankhamun's body was a fragile instrument, burdened by politics, divine expectation, and the weight of an empire. His magnificent tomb, for all its splendor, can't hide that. The gold glitters, the chariots shine, and the mask smiles its serene, golden smile. But just beneath that brilliant surface lies evidence of panic, human error, and a tragic mortality, all preserved forever. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's tomb is both spectacular and deeply unsettling. It's a treasure chest of breathtaking beauty, but it's also the document of a panicked cover-up. It's a mirror reflecting our own human fragility. It shows us how a civilization obsessed with perfection dealt with weakness, and how a boy king's death was stage-managed to protect appearances. The gold and glitter were never enough to hide the broken bones, the signs of illness, or the brutal reality of politics. They could only whisper, faintly, through the cracks, through the hurried placements, and through the careful preservation of an illusion. And so, 3,000 years later, the tomb continues to speak. It speaks of a boy, not even a man, whose body carried the scars of his royal bloodline, his political burdens, and the impossible expectations placed upon him. It speaks of powerful advisors who managed his life and death with equal anxiety. It speaks of gold, chariots, masks, and canes that both mesmerize us and mislead us. And above all, it speaks of a simple, uncomfortable truth, that even kings, even those believed to be gods, are mortal, vulnerable, and ultimately subject to forces beyond their control. Tutankhamun, sealed beneath layers of gold, continues to whisper, reminding us that history is never as clean or as perfect as it seems, and that sometimes the brightest treasures are used to hide the darkest secrets. A century ago, the world held its breath as a sealed door in the Valley of the Kings was opened, revealing the treasures of a forgotten pharaoh. The golden mask of Tutankhamun became an icon, a symbol of ancient Egypt's splendor. But beneath the layers of gold and lapis lazuli lies a mystery that forensics, archaeology, and history have struggled to solve for 100 years. How did the boy king die? The story isn't just about a pharaoh. It's a gripping tale of fragility, power, and a cover-up that has lasted for more than 3,000 years. When we look at Tutankhamun's mummy, we're not just looking at a king, we're looking at a crime scene. Modern scans reveal a catalogue of injuries: a severely broken leg, fractured just above the knee, cracks in his skull, a brittle, malformed spine. At first glance, it looks like a tragic accident, perhaps a fall from a speeding chariot during a hunt, a popular theory for years. But the evidence is maddeningly ambiguous. Each clue pulls us in a different direction. Was it an accident, or was it something far more sinister? Let's consider the political climate of the time. Tutankhamun wasn't just a boy. He was a pawn in a high-stakes game. His father, Akhenaten, had turned Egypt upside down, abandoning its traditional gods for a single sun deity. It was a religious revolution that left the old priesthood powerless and angry. Tutankhamun's rise to the throne was a compromise, a move to restore the old ways and bring stability back to the kingdom. But this young king, frail and suffering from multiple health issues, was a fragile linchpin. His sudden death at just 19 conveniently removed a potential liability. It opened the door for powerful figures in his court, like his advisor Ai and the general Horemheb, to seize control. The motive for murder was certainly there. The tomb itself screams urgency, even panic. It's unusually small for a pharaoh, likely a private tomb repurposed in a hurry. The treasures, while magnificent, were piled in with a sense of haste, not the meticulous order you'd expect. Statues of gods face outward, not just as protectors, but perhaps as sentinels designed to distract, to draw your eye away from the subtle imperfections. It's as if the burial was a frantic effort to close a chapter, to seal away not just a king, but the questions surrounding his death. And then there's the body. The embalmers did something bizarre. They used an excessive amount of black resin, so much that it essentially glued the mummy to the bottom of its golden coffin. In some places, this resin seems to have chemically reacted, causing a kind of spontaneous combustion that literally cooked the king's remains. Why such a rush? Why the overuse of materials? One theory suggests they were trying to conceal something. The horrific leg fracture, which shows no signs of healing, would have been a gruesome open wound. Perhaps the hasty resin-soaked embalming was a desperate attempt to contain the damage and prepare the body for the afterlife before decomposition or scrutiny could set in. We know from his remains that he had a club foot and bone disease, forcing him to walk with a cane. In fact, over 130 canes were found in his tomb. He also suffered from multiple strains of malaria, the most severe kind on earth. His immune system was weak, his body fragile. For a king expected to be a divine, powerful figure, this was a profound vulnerability, A simple fall could have been catastrophic. That broken leg, combined with his other ailments, could have easily led to a fatal infection. So, was it an accident that his weakened body simply couldn't survive? Or did his enemies exploit his physical frailty, orchestrating an accident they knew he wouldn't recover from? The golden mask is the perfect symbol for this entire mystery. On the surface, it's a serene, perfect, divine image of a ruler, but beneath it lies a story of suffering, trauma, and political manipulation. The mask isn't just art, it's propaganda. It's a deliberate effort to project an image of eternal power and perfection, to mask the uncomfortable reality of a young, sickly king whose death was, at best, a tragic accident, and at worst, a cold-blooded assassination. The chariots in his tomb weren't just for royal processions, they were props for a king who likely couldn't stand on one for long. The thrones weren't just seats of power, they were necessities for a ruler who struggled to walk. Every object in the tomb tells two stories, the official story of divine majesty, and the whispered story of human weakness. Even the so-called curse of the pharaohs plays into this narrative of concealment. When members of the excavation team fell ill and died, the world sensationalized it as ancient magic. Science now tells us it was likely exposure to dormant mold and bacteria sealed in the tomb for millennia. But this myth of a curse served a purpose. It created a powerful distraction, a supernatural horror story that drew attention away from the real, human drama hidden within the sarcophagus. The greatest secret of the tomb wasn't a curse, it was the evidence of a mismanaged death, of political panic, and of a desperate attempt to control the story. So, where does that leave us? With a cold case that's 3,300 years old. We have a victim, weakened by genetic illnesses. We have a suspicious pattern of injuries. We have a political climate ripe with motive for murder. And we have a burial that feels more like a cover-up than a ceremony. The truth is, we may never know for certain what happened in Tutankhamun's final days. The clues are too fragmented, the whispers from the past too faint. Was he a victim of a tragic accident, a casualty of his own frail body? Or was he a chess piece removed from the board by those who coveted his power? Perhaps the answer is a combination of all three: a vulnerable king, an unfortunate accident, and a court that seized the opportunity to consolidate its power and hide the messy details behind a wall of gold. The story of Tutankhamun is a powerful reminder that history is never as clean or as simple as it seems. It shows us that behind the golden masks and divine titles, the figures of the past were just as human, just as fragile, and just as caught up in the webs of power and politics as we are today. The boy king's tomb was meant to secure his immortality, but what it truly immortalized was a profound and enduring mystery. For over a century, the treasures of Tutankhamun have dazzled the world. We see the gold, the intricate chariots, the famous death mask, and we imagine a king of immense power and divine perfection. But what if the tomb's greatest secret isn't hidden in its inscriptions or treasures, but in its flaws? What if, beneath the glitter, lies a quiet, desperate story of haste, panic, and human fragility? Today, we're going to listen to the whispers of Tutankhamun's tomb, a story that history tried to bury under layers of gold. The tale begins not with the king, but with a boy constrained by illness, manipulated by politics, and struggling under the weight of a crown he was never truly fit to wear. Forensic studies of his mummy paint a grim picture. His skull shows evidence of trauma, not from a single, fatal blow, but possibly from multiple impacts over time. A severe fracture in his leg was so devastating that it likely became infected and led directly to his death. Was it an accident? Perhaps a fall from a chariot? Or was it something more sinister? Genetic analysis shows the consequences of generations of inbreeding within the royal family, leaving him with congenital conditions like a clubfoot. He was physically frail, and his body was further ravaged by repeated bouts of malaria. Imagine this young ruler, expected to be a god on earth, yet barely able to walk without support. His tomb contains over 130 canes, often dismissed as ceremonial. But the truth is, they were his daily reality, a constant reminder of a weakness that had to be hidden from the world. This tension between illusion and reality is palpable within the tomb itself. Every artifact, every statue, feels like part of an elaborate performance designed to conceal the uncomfortable truth. Massive statues of the king face outward, projecting an image of divine authority, drawing your eyes toward his power and away from the fragile body in the sarcophagus. The burial itself was a rushed affair. The intricate process of mummification, usually a meticulous 70-day ritual, was clearly hurried. Excessive amounts of black resin were poured over the mummy and coffin, almost as if to glue everything together, a desperate attempt to preserve a king who was falling apart. Some theories suggest the embalmers were working against a deadline, perhaps to quell political instability following his sudden death. Even the tomb's layout whispers of haste. Unlike the grand symmetrical tombs of other pharaohs, Tutankhamun's is small, almost an afterthought. It was likely a non-royal tomb, hastily repurposed for a king who died unexpectedly. Inside, priceless objects were stacked carelessly. Beautiful thrones and beds were found misaligned, hinting at a chaotic placement that contradicts the sacred, orderly rituals expected for a pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. It's a scene of organized chaos, a desperate scramble to uphold an illusion of eternal order, while reality was unraveling. Every choice reflects a dual purpose: to honor the dead king, and to bury the secrets of his vulnerability, secrets that threatened the very stability of the court. When Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon breached the tomb in 1922, they weren't just met with gold. They reported a sense of unease, an oppressive atmosphere that clung to the air. While the curse was a media fabrication, the underlying reality was perhaps more chilling. They had unsealed a chamber closed for over 3,000 years, potentially exposing themselves to ancient molds and pathogens. The psychological toll was also immense. They were the first to confront this millennial-old mortality, to see the fragile remains of a king beneath the spectacle. The tomb itself became a silent participant, reminding them that the past is never truly dead, and curiosity can have subtle, lingering consequences. The treasures were designed to mislead. Gold and lapis lazuli project an unshakable, divine authority. The death mask, with its serene, perfect face, creates a narrative of eternal peace. But, for the careful observer, the cracks in this perfect facade are everywhere. The hurried embalming, the sheer number of canes and walking sticks, the rushed placement of priceless artifacts, these aren't just details, they are the story. They reveal the human cost of maintaining an image of power. They show us the reality of illness and the lengths a society will go to preserve its illusions. The tomb's design is a paradox, both magnificent and deeply unnerving. It's a masterpiece of art and a confession of fear. Even with all our modern technology, the central mysteries remain. Genetic testing confirms the inbreeding and congenital issues. Bone studies show the fractures and chronic illnesses. Chemical analysis points to malaria. But none of this can definitively answer the big questions. How did he really break his leg? Was it an accident during a hunt he was too frail for? Or was he pushed? Was the embalming rushed due to political urgency, a need to get a new pharaoh on the throne quickly? Or was it fear of the body's decay, or fear of what his death represented? The tomb offers clues, not certainties. It's a whispering narrative that demands we look beyond the gold and listen patiently to the silence. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's tomb reflects ancient Egypt's complex relationship with death. This was a civilization that revered the afterlife but feared the exposure of human weakness. The mummification, the treasures, the golden mask, these were all part of a grand act of concealment. They were designed to shield the living from the uncomfortable truth of vulnerability, and to ensure that the boy king's death reinforced the divine order rather than undermining it. The tomb is a document not just of wealth, but of deep-seated anxiety and the desperate desire to control a story across millennia. And yet, beneath all that spectacle, the whispers of the truth remain. The fractures in the bones, the hasty burial, the excessive resin, they all tell a story of urgency and imperfection. The boy king's brief, constrained life is encoded in these details, a narrative hidden in plain sight. The dazzling gold doesn't erase human fragility, it just buries it. Tutankhamun's body, preserved yet broken, is a powerful reminder that perfection is an illusion, that even kings are mortal, and that history often hides as much as it reveals. The tomb's influence extends far beyond archaeology. It has shaped our modern perceptions of ancient Egypt, of death, and of power. We are captivated by the treasure, yet the underlying story of suffering, political maneuvering, and raw human frailty casts a long shadow over the spectacle. The whisper of vulnerability persists, reminding us that weakness and mortality are inescapable, even when hidden beneath mountains of gold. In this way, Tutankhamun's tomb is timeless. It is both a treasure and a confession. It speaks of a civilization grappling with its own fears, of a young king burdened by a failing body, and of the universal human need to project strength while concealing weakness. The gold glitters, the mask smiles, but beneath it all lies the quiet, persistent story of panic, fragility, and the raw truth of life and death. The whispers continue, and the boy king, sealed beneath layers of splendor, remains an eternal witness to the secrets that history tried so hard to hide. Thanks for joining us on this journey beyond the gold. For over a century, the tomb of Tutankhamun has mesmerized the world. The glittering gold, the serene mask, the magnificent chariots, they all tell a story of divine kingship and unimaginable wealth. But beneath this dazzling spectacle lies a much darker, more human narrative, a story whispered by the boy king's own body. Modern science has allowed us to look past the gold and see the fragile human being underneath. CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed a life plagued by illness and physical challenges. Tutankhamun likely suffered from a clubfoot, making it difficult to walk without assistance. This explains the more than 130 walking canes found in his tomb, not just symbols of authority, but practical aids for a king who struggled with every step. Genetic testing also confirmed he was the product of incest, a common practice among Egyptian royalty that often led to congenital health issues. His immune system was likely compromised, and evidence of malaria has been found in his remains, suggesting he battled chronic infections throughout his short life. The circumstances surrounding his death, at just 19 years old, are shrouded in mystery. For decades, a fracture in his skull led many to believe he was murdered, struck from behind in a palace coup. Instead, attention has shifted to a severe fracture in his left leg. It was a nasty break, an open wound that would have been incredibly painful and prone to infection. We may never know for sure, but it's highly likely this injury, combined with his already weakened state, led to his death. The way his body was prepared for the afterlife speaks volumes about the urgency and perhaps even panic surrounding his passing. The embalmers worked hastily. They poured enormous quantities of black resin over his mummy, so much so that it fused his body to the bottom of his golden coffin. This unusual and messy procedure might have been a desperate attempt to stabilize the broken body, or simply a sign of a burial rushed for political reasons. His father, Akhenaten, had thrown Egypt into chaos with his radical religious reforms. Tutankhamen's reign was an attempt to restore the old gods and bring back stability, but he was a young, fragile ruler. His sudden demise allowed more powerful figures, like his advisor Ai and the general Horemheb, to seize the throne. Did they orchestrate his death, or did they simply take advantage of an unfortunate accident? The tomb keeps its secrets, but the evidence points to a court riddled with intrigue, where the life of a boy king was a pawn in a much larger game of power. Every object in the tomb tells this dual story. We see magnificent chariots, symbols of a powerful pharaoh leading his army, but we also see that some were lightweight, perhaps for ceremonial use by a king who couldn't handle the rigors of a real battle. We see golden thrones and statues projecting an image of divine perfection, and right beside them, we find a simple wooden box containing his two stillborn daughters, a quiet, heartbreaking testament to personal tragedy and the fragility of his family line. The famous golden mask is the ultimate symbol of this contradiction. Its perfect, serene face has become an icon of ancient Egypt, but it conceals the reality of a young man with a deformed foot, a broken leg, and a body ravaged by disease. It's a literal mask, hiding the pain and vulnerability of the human being beneath. The tomb wasn't just a monument to a king's glory. It was a carefully constructed illusion, designed to project strength where there was weakness, perfection where there was frailty. Even the legendary curse of Tutankhamun can be seen in a new light. The sudden death of Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor, just weeks after the tomb was opened, fueled sensational stories of a pharaoh's supernatural revenge. But the reality is likely far more mundane. The sealed tomb was an incubator for ancient mold and bacteria. It's plausible that Carnarvon, already in poor health, succumbed to an infection after breathing in airborne pathogens that had been trapped for 3,000 years. The real curse wasn't magic. It was a microscopic echo of the same vulnerability that plagued Tutankhamun himself. Reminder that life is fragile, whether you're an ancient king or a modern explorer. So what is the ultimate legacy of Tutankhamun? It's not just the gold or the art. It's the powerful, whispering story that emerges when we look closer. It's the story of a boy, born into immense power, but constrained by a weak body and political turmoil. But in its haste, it accidentally preserved the evidence of his humanity. The broken bones, the walking sticks, the rushed embalming, these are the details that tell the true story. And in Tutankhamun's case, his story of struggle, pain, and fragility is far more compelling than any legend of treasure or curses. For nearly a century, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb has captivated us, with its glittering gold and whispers of an ancient curse. But what if the real story is far darker, hidden in plain sight, beneath the very treasures we admire? Let us look past the splendor and listen to the silent truths the boy king's tomb has been trying to tell us for millennia. When we think of King Tut, we imagine divine kingship and immense power. But the evidence tells a different story, one of human frailty, chronic illness, and a life lived under crushing pressure. The young pharaoh, who died at just 18, was not the golden figure of strength we see on his mask. His body, his tomb, and his treasures all point to a life constrained by weakness. Forensic analysis has revealed a shocking portrait of his health. Genetic testing confirms he was a product of inbreeding, which likely led to a host of congenital deformities, including a clawfoot. Chemical analysis of his remains shows he suffered from malaria, possibly multiple times. His bones were brittle, and studies of his skeleton reveal fractures and signs of chronic pain. This was not a mighty ruler, but a young man who likely struggled to even walk without assistance. This is where the treasures of his tomb begin to reveal their secrets. Among the golden chariots and magnificent thrones, archaeologists found over 130 canes and walking sticks. These weren't just ceremonial. They were practical necessities for a king who couldn't stand on his own. The dazzling splendor of the tomb becomes a carefully constructed illusion, designed to project an image of divine perfection while masking a painful reality. The mysteries deepen when we look at his death. For years, theories have swirled. Was it an accident? A fall from a chariot during a hunt seems unlikely for someone with his physical limitations. Was it disease? Malaria and his other conditions certainly weakened him, but do they explain his sudden end? Or was it something more sinister? A fracture in his leg, which showed no signs of healing, suggests a severe injury right before his death. There's also a controversial fracture in his skull. While some believe it happened during the mummification process, others argue it could be evidence of a fatal blow. The rushed nature of his burial only adds to the suspicion. The embalmers worked hastily, using excessive amounts of black resin that literally fused his body to his golden coffin. Why the panic? Why the urgency to seal him away? This is where politics enters the picture. Tutankhamun ruled during a period of immense turmoil. His father, Akhenaten, had appended centuries of religious tradition, and the court was desperate to restore stability. Tutankhamun, a fragile and sickly boy king, may have been seen as an obstacle. His sudden death conveniently allowed powerful figures, like his advisor Ai and the general Horemheb, to seize control and steer Egypt back to the old ways. Was his death politically orchestrated? The tomb doesn't give a definitive answer, but it preserves these whispers of conspiracy, leaving his final moments suspended between accident, disease, and deliberate intervention. The tomb's design itself seems to support this narrative of concealment. Shrines are nested inside one another, but not perfectly aligned. Artifacts are stacked in ways that suggest haste, not careful ceremonial placement. Statues of gods face outward, as if to guard a secret and direct attention away from the imperfections within. The entire burial chamber feels less like a serene resting place and more like a scene of a hurried cover-up, a desperate attempt to project grandeur while hiding the uncomfortable truth. Even the famous curse of the pharaohs can be seen through this lens. When Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor, died suddenly after the tomb's opening, the world was gripped by tales of supernatural retribution. The media frenzy was powerful, but the scientific explanation was far more mundane. Exposure to ancient mold and bacteria sealed within the tomb for 3,000 years. Yet, the idea of a curse served a purpose. It created a myth that was more exciting than the unsettling reality of a vulnerable king, a rushed burial, and the silent manipulation of history by those in power. The curse became another layer of misdirection, obscuring the tomb's real, and far more human, tragedy. Every object, every fracture, every hurried detail tells a story of a civilization obsessed with perfection, trying to reconcile the ideal of a divine king with the reality of a mortal, fragile boy. The golden mask projects an image of serene divinity, but underneath, the king's body was broken. The chariots suggest a life of action and strength, but the canes reveal a life of pain and dependence. The tomb dazzles the eye, but its true message is whispered in the shadows. So, the next time you see the golden mask of Tutankhamun, remember the boy beneath it. A boy burdened by illness, trapped by political expectations, and whose death remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. His tomb is not just a treasure chest, it's a crime scene, a medical file, and a political manifesto all rolled into one. It's a timeless and powerful reminder that even beneath layers of pure gold, the truth of our shared human fragility can never be fully concealed. The greatest treasure Tutankhamun left us wasn't his gold, but his story, a silent, glittering narrative of the uncomfortable truths that history often prefers to bury.